Good afternoon. I'm Jill Kerr-Conway, and I'm so pleased to be here with you today. I want to applaud the efforts of all those who have made today's conference possible. It's a really very special occasion, and one that will live with us all, I think, in memory. Our first panel on Eleanor Roosevelt was fascinating, and it made me understand why friends of the two people, Eleanor and Franklin, who we knew in Washington, were always on one side or the other. So the story would be, she pushed him too hard, or he didn't listen to her. But it was a wonderful session. It's been a great joy for me to serve on the board of directors of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation. The Kennedy Library, even when it's closed, remains a remarkable treasure, a beacon for us all that captures a unique moment in the history of this country, which represents our finest ideals about politics, justice, and public service. I urge you all to visit the dynamic museum and attend the library's many wonderful programs. They will, as they have done for me over the years, refuel your highest aspirations. I'd always leave one of these sessions going out determined to put out a bit more energy, just get a little bit more done in the right causes. And of course, they'll inspire you to advance the causes that you believe in and that we've inherited from the past. I first arrived in this country in September of 1960 to begin my graduate work at the history in Harvard University. So actually, I'm old enough to know the whole 50 years we're analyzing. This choice didn't represent the fulfillment of a lifetime dream to become a scholar. I arrived at it instead after exhausting all the possibilities of interesting careers in my native country of Australia, discovering one by one that they were not open to women. It turns out, of course, that I was not alone, but I thought I was at the time. The issues of women's role in society are, and in the workplace, still raging in some areas, but they were raging just under the surface, or just beginning to bubble over at the time we're talking about today. The issue of women's role in society is something that I believe is not ever going to be settled. I think there will be a continuing battle because we have two sexes for people to want to define different roles for them in some respects, or different talents. But the important thing about the history we're looking at today is that the battle was about equal right to express yourself, to earn your living, to get an education, to have the full legal rights. I happened to touch down in Boston at the height of the 1960 presidential campaign, and I even attended one of JFK's appearances in Boston. And I have to say that one of the things that is most interesting to me is the way in which confidence about change in the future was somehow or other communicated by the president-elect's body language, voice, appearance, which was a kind of nonverbal communication that worked. So I saw some of JFK's rallies as he sprinted towards the finish line, and it was a hopeful and promising time in America and in world history. President Kennedy pledged in that spirited campaign to get the country moving again, and women, especially working women, were eager to see what that could mean for them. Initially, some, including, as we've just heard, Eleanor Roosevelt, were disappointed at the lack of women President Kennedy appointed to his cabinet and other high-ranking positions. The one Kennedy female appointment that did make a difference, and a very dramatic one, was naming Esther Peterson as the Assistant Secretary of Labor and head of the Women's Bureau. It was Peterson's idea to appoint a presidential commission, the first of its kind devoted to women's issues. In so doing, President Kennedy was calling the nation's attention to the structural inequalities and outright discrimination against women in the workforce, which needed to be redressed. When I was a graduate student at Harvard, I never thought at any moment that I might actually ever be appointed to the faculty there. Harvard did not employ women as academic staff. So you knew from day one that you could not possibly work there. So I think that underlined for all of us, all my friends as well, some things that needed to be corrected. We'll hear much more from our next panel about the Commission itself and what it helped to spawn. It was not the only major event in the history of the feminist movement. That occurred in 1963, when that amazing book of Betty Friedan's, The Feminine Mystique, was published. Yet the Commission's impact should not be underestimated. According to one activist, the national conversation it initiated was the catalytic event which signaled the rebirth of feminism in the United States. And certainly, the combination of the political focus that was developed and the writings of the great feminist writers of the era created a really electric situation. As was mentioned earlier, brief biographies of our panelists are indicated in your program, but let me just mention a word about our next session. We are thrilled to have with us two distinguished historians of the period, Dorothy Sue Cobble of Rutgers University and Ellen Fitzpatrick of the University of New Hampshire. Our moderator is columnist Eleanor Clift, who was one of the first female journalists in our nation's capital to break the glass ceiling, in her case at Newsweek. And a special appreciation to the individual who has traveled the farthest to join us, Aileen Hernandez, who lives in California and whose unparalleled career advocating for equal rights embodies what this conference is all about, including her work as an organizer with the International Lady Garment Workers Union, as the first woman to serve on President Johnson's Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and as the second president of the National Organization of Women. So we have a very special time ahead for us, and please join me in welcoming Eleanor Clift, Sue Cobble, Ellen Fitzpatrick, and Aileen Hernandez. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I was thinking as you were speaking that the report was really one small step in this journey of feminism and equal rights, but it was one giant step for womankind at the time. And so we're here to talk about the Commission, it's the history and the legacy that have flowed from it. And we have two historians, Ellen Fitzpatrick and Sue Cobble, and a civil rights activist, Aileen Hernandez. And I'm going to start with Aileen. She was appointed by President Lyndon Johnson to the newly established Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC. She served until 1966, when she formed her own urban consulting firm. Aileen, take us back to that time and when you got the call from the White House, what the climate was so soon after the assassination of a beloved president, a new president trying to forge his own path, but building on the legacy of John F. Kennedy. And this is a whole new adventure into the area of equal rights for women.
If you don't mind, I'll also tell you how to pronounce my first name.
Oh, definitely. I can't
My
believe
mother would be decidedly upset.
Okay.
It's Aileen.
It's Eileen.
Okay, you're
Oh,
right.
see, I was born in Brooklyn and grew up in Queens, and so we take
I
these
was born-
letters, it's A-I-L.
I was born in Brooklyn too, so you must
Okay.
be in on another block.
Okay.
And I only said that because I think it's important to know where we are talking from. And as I was listening to us before, and I was hearing some of the things that happened, I knew Eleanor from a date that I was 6. She was my honor person. And we all got a chance she's going through the city of Brooklyn, which was considered a city in those days.
Still is.
Right. And the president and Mrs. Roosevelt frequently came through the cities, and when the children were coming out of school, they could come down, and that beautiful car would go by, and the kids waved all the time. And they were very much loved in a lot of ways, and Eleanor particularly, because she is a person and was a person who really was open to all kinds of things. And as I see her, I really see her starting to think about herself, not to think about all of these other things, but what she was concerned about. And there are a number of books talking about her going to France and learning things about it and what was happening with the children, and how she pushed the president to bring certain persons on the anything that he was talking to her about. She was pushing, because she had learned that she had something that ought to be said on that floor too. And she was an interesting person from the very beginning. I actually met her when I became a part of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. Having come from school, going there, meeting her, and feeling I already knew her because she was there when I was 6. And I found her a very open and very warm woman, and a very smart woman on a lot of things. She was a person who did not see herself as other opportunities, just sitting in the places where a more wealthy family would come together. She grew, and she kept growing about what was an interesting thing for her. And one of the things I found that really made her want to do things, she pushed the president a lot. She pushed him very often on things that he should be doing. And when we hear about other women of that era, we find that Eleanor was behind the scene saying, this is a person who ought to do something. So she brought us into the labor union in some ways, because before that, very few women were in the labor unions. The garment union, yes. And she's known very well in the garment union, and she has gone to many of their assemblies. She has pushed the labor unions. She has come to a lot of things. And my other wonderful thing about her was I have a picture of her. She and I are standing there talking in the labor union run by Dubinsky, which is the kind of union that we were talking about before, women's clothing. That's what they did in those days. And many of them are people who came from other countries, came into the United States, couldn't find a job anywhere, and because sometimes they didn't speak English, so they had to wait till they got to that. But a lot of those women went into the garment union, and it was not a nice place to go. You already have heard, I think, in the past about fires and the number of young women who died way before 1950 or even earlier than that, which suggested to her that that was not a good thing for not just women to do, but nobody ought to be doing that. And so she really got out there and tried to get the kind of people who would be out there trying to change what not happening for other people. And I always thought of that as the first push that we really needed to have. A lot of times women do not feel that they can get into these things. It's not a good woman who does that. And I really think she has made it possible for the place that we're talking about and how we got here and what we did belongs to Eleanor. And I think we should give her that kind of a responsibility. She was very, very warm woman in a lot of ways. And she wanted to see things happening. Some other woman who came down later came down because Eleanor again said to the president, we need to get some things done in this place where women are not getting good pay. And what did she do? She got a woman in there, the first woman ever to sit in one of our major, what would we call it, for federal, I guess it's good to say that here, governmental people to take the spot. And she did. And she made a lot of difference, and it was not surprising to me at all when she was called to go internationally and do all the things that she did. And I think it's good to go back and try to find more things about people as we go along, because we don't often get a lot. Not a lot of things are told to us. So I believe she is a very important historic woman in the United States. And it's been proved by the fact that people have given her that honor. So I think we should also try to figure out, she's had to be doing something before that, way before this issue that we have been talking about. And maybe we just ought to pump her up a little bit.
Right. Well, yes. Well, and she was really a figure in a political dynasty, and the Kennedys were another political dynasty, and it wasn't always wine and roses between the two factions of the Democratic Party.
Do you know any Democrats that get together and don't have a new home? That's right. I don't know any of them.
Right.
Over a long period of time.
So I want to turn to Professor Sue Cobble. I think we were talking in the break about how Kennedy had to be pushed in this direction for women's rights and civil rights. And Eleanor was served as somewhat of a fraud on the outside, but there were also some, rivalries between the political families. If you could talk about that a little bit.
I think I'll write a book, it'll be one page.
Right, okay. I think that's...
I think you'd like Ellen actually to talk about that.
Oh, Ellen, I'm sorry, okay.
That's okay.
Okay.
I'm the one with the face that looks like
I'm
the map
sorry.
of Ireland.
Okay.
The Fitzpatrick.
Okay, well, you
so
could have ducked that if you wanted.
I'm well poised to answer this question. As I listen to you, I understand fully the argument you were making. There's another part of the argument, and that is that John F. Kennedy really represented an element of the Democratic Party, the Irish Catholic, from immigrant background, who had really found in American politics a form of great mobility. And the interesting thing was that as late as 1960, despite the importance of these ethnic immigrants to the Democratic Party, they had never been able to grab the top prize in American politics. And they suffered from, I think, I suppose as a tribe we suffered from many different things, but one thing they suffered from was a sense that they were good to be ward bosses, they were good to get those votes out, they were good to sort of staff the lower rungs of the party, but their Catholicism was an issue. And of course, Al Smith went down in flames in the early 20th century over this issue. And so the issue of ethnicity and religion, and I think to some extent background, probably surfaced more than many would now admit in the political career of John F. Kennedy and some of the tensions that existed between the Roosevelts and the Kennedys. It's a complicated story. There have been books written about it. But suffice it to say that there was no love lost between the two. And yet, the president and Mrs. Roosevelt did come together, certainly in the final days, as Alida recounted of the campaign, and then around this extremely important commission that the president was willing to endorse. Esther Peterson describes in her oral history at the Kennedy Library being appointed as, she was then a lobbyist, I believe, for the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, and she was assigned to this young, newly elected congressman, and she suspected that as the woman in the union, she was being sent to this unimportant new congressman, and the two of them immediately bonded when they met. And she really became John F. Kennedy's tutor around issues having to do with labor and labor legislation. So the commission, I think, I'm answering a question you didn't really ask, but the commission, I think its origins are far more complex than Mrs. Roosevelt's very important role in it. And that had to do with the way in which the role of women in the labor movement came together with the role of women in the Democratic Party. There's a whole other group of women we haven't talked about so far, people like Katie Lusheim, who was important in the Democratic National Committee. And those two groups together really helped elect John F. Kennedy. He was certainly well aware of it. And they helped to move this issue forward so that in 1961, Kennedy appoints the Presidential Commission. In 1962, he issues an executive order prohibiting sex discrimination in the hiring of federal employees. And in 1963, he signs the Equal Pay Act. Those were three legislative initiatives on behalf of women's rights that were probably more significant than anything since the early 20th century, or perhaps elements of the Social Security Act. So all of that grew out of women's labor, the role of women in the labor movement, I would say. But Sue is the expert on that.
Yes, that's a nice segue to Sue Cobble, who has a joint appointment at Rutgers in the Department of Labor Studies and Employment Relations and the Department of History. And I see that you have a book coming out next year. The title is Feminism Unfinished, A Short, Surprising History of America's Women's Movement. Can you give us a preview?
That's a book that's co-authored with Linda Gordon and Astrid Henry, and it is about a century of American feminism from 1920s forward. My part of the book is from the 50 years from 1920 to 1970. And in thinking about the President's Commission on the Status of Women, there are two issues really that I want to say a bit more about, building on what we saw in the film. There's definitely what I would think of as an organizational legacy. And many people come to the President's Commission thinking about that. Well, it was important because it helped spark the rise of what I call a new feminism. I'm a believer that there's always feminism. It just changes. Each generation has to reconceive it and remake it. And so it is important organizationally. But for me, one of the most exciting things about it is its intellectual agenda. And I think of it as one that we need to honor, to know more about, to return to, because they, in fact, I think their vision of what needed to happen in society is very much where I think we are now. And being here and being invited to participate in this has been so wonderful because I reread their report, which was called American Women. It was a bestseller when it was first issued in 1963, so arguably, the two books of 63 that sparked the women's movement, or the new women's movement, are the report and Betty Friedan's book. But when you read it, what you're struck by is how different the feminism of that moment was. basically. And it is a feminism that came out of the 30s and World War II. It came out of a generation that knew about economic inequality. It came out of the experience of wage-earning women after the war being told that they had to go back to the pink-collar ghetto. At the same time, they were having more and more babies. So it came out of that, what the feminists called the double day. But you start to read the report, and the first thing that jumps out at you is that government can make a difference. This was a moment in which people believed that government could matter, that it was an important part of the solution. That's why, in fact, they wanted a government commission. They were inspired by earlier commissions, the 1947 Truman Commission, again, part of this era in which there was a sense that government really mattered. They were inspired by the UN commissions on the status of women. Many of the women that Esther Peterson was close to, people like Frida Miller, who was the Women's Bureau director in the 40s. They were very much involved in the UN Commission. So there was a sense that what we want is to think not narrowly about women's rights or narrowly about how individual women can get ahead, can lean in, but how we can transform societies so that the majority of women can have a sense of progress. And I think that's one of the intellectual agendas and legacies. And then there are very specific things as you move through.
Well, the headline in the clip that we saw was U.S. Commission urges women to sue. Did that actually happen? Did it set off some litigation? No.
It didn't really.
No.
Most of the laws that come out are laws that are not going to go anywhere for a long period of time. But you have to do something. And women do vote. When my mother was up, women didn't vote. My mother was ready to tell my father, I'm not going to stay home with you if you don't go out there and get the women's vote to give. So there are a number of things that move organizations and move different things that have made some major changes. Having half the society not have the opportunity to be out there and arguing for things that need to be done for all the society is an important thing that is not there. And I'm not suggesting that he was going to do that. That was not it. But I would totally agree that he was one of the people that moved people first and got a much larger education because women were in that issue. So every step we take there should be something right. And I don't believe that he believed that something should go on that way. And I think if he were in place now, he probably wouldn't be dealing with how people vote now.
The other thing is the labor movement seems so powerful then compared
Yes.
to today.
It's gone.
Right.
I think that's very important in terms of the role of the labor unions in the Democratic Party and the kind of clout they had on delivering the votes of their members. And we're now living in we're now living in a period when a far smaller percentage of the labor force is organized. And
yes, I think because the other side of the people who go and vote don't have any interest in doing that. It's the people who are outside of what this country could be that would make a difference. And that's what happens when people go in that position by saying, we need to make some slight changes here and there in our Constitution. They have a reason to do that. The union has a reason, and so do the people who are on the other side on some of the issues that we're talking about. So from my point of view, I see exactly what happened here, and that I thought was important. I thought Kennedy was good. He was a new face. He was a person that was thinking about it in a different way, and that was a plus. But there was a lot of other things that needed to be happening. Coming back from California, for example, everybody comes out to California, whether they're Democrat, Republican, socialist, whatever, because that's where the money is. And we know that the money is a problem in the governments now. And I hope that the group that talks about governance, that they look at where are the issues that are not occurring right now.
Right. Well, the Kennedy era sparked a great interest in public service and trust in government and Camelot and all of that. And today we're sitting in the middle of a federal government shutdown, and distrust of government is at I don't want to say an all-time low, but it's pretty low. And
I think one of the important things to think about in terms of that very issue is that although Kennedy was willing to really respond favorably to the initiatives that came before him, as Esther Peterson also points out in her oral history, he didn't come to her and say, "What can I do for American women?"
Right.
So the impetus for change was coming from outside forces that had access to this young president, who was open-minded, he was smart, he had this relationship with Esther Peterson, he was willing to listen to a reasoned argument, he was a liberal, he was open, certainly concerned about labor issues, but the activism, the push, the lobbying, the pressure came from mobilized women and other citizens who made all of this happen. So people that are sitting around waiting for change to come from,
right.
outside are going to be waiting a long time, I'm afraid.
Right, and President Johnson picked this up. I mean, he didn't seem to have a natural history of activism on behalf of women's rights, but he could see the changes in the country. Do you have any memories of President Johnson from?
Oh, yes. I had a lot of
Okay.
opportunities to talk with him. And on some things I thought he was good, and on other things I thought he was terrible.
Right.
So I don't think there is anybody out there that is so good on every issue that we think we could stop at this point or continue in that look. I believe very strongly in people who are working class people, which is what they're always called. I don't know what the other people are doing for their money. But what I think is happening, we're giving all women, not just those women who are in certain positions where they can speak out. I would like to see that happen for all women. And I would like to see women, and it started on that other one who came in and moved in certain directions, and he said, we've got to do something about this issue. When we had just a fun night to do something, I could tell you some stories. You would be rolling in the floor laughing about how people looked at that law in 1963,
Right.
about how they were going to handle it. What is going to come out of it? What is going to come out of it? And what they thought was going to come up was the men were going to win it, and they weren't going to have anything change. I'll tell you one funny story, and it's only a short one. I was invited by a whole bunch of employers to come and explain what the law was all about and how it was working. It was not the best law ever written in the United States.
Tell us what the law was.
Well, this was the beginning of
the
the law.
beginning-
We were talking of
okay.
equal opportunity for women and all the rest.
Okay.
And it was decided that it was really going to happen. And we got invited to some employers. And one employer that invited me to come as the only woman of 5 people on the board at that time, he invited me and got a couple of other men to come. And he said, well, why don't we just go and have lunch somewhere? So we were in New York. We went to one little New York place to have lunch. And I got to the door and they said, you can't come in. And this was a woman who told me that. You can't come in. I said, I beg your pardon? I said, I have 5 men from 2 different companies who are waiting for me to come to explain a law that we have. You can't come in. I said, oh, why can't I come in? She said, women are not allowed to come at lunchtime. They have to only come with a man and they can come at night. And besides, you have on a kind of dress that you should not be coming in here with. What did I have on? Slacks. Oh. I had on slacks. And she insisted I should not come in. So I got a brilliant idea. I left the restaurant. I went down where the hotel section was, went into the bathroom. I wasn't going in there just to go to the bathroom. And I changed my clothes. I had on the slacks. You know, slacks go down to the ankles. And I said, well, what I'll do is I'll take the slacks off. I had a very fancy slack suit on. And it was long, and it was very attractive. So I took the bottom off. And I went back, and that woman was gone. Now, that still was down here. But that woman would not let me in. So when I went in, it was the best discussion I ever had with any of the employers, because they couldn't believe that that's what would happen. Okay. So I think there are all kinds of things we have to fix in our society. We're not the greatest place in the world. And so I think this is the kind of thing that Eleanor would really have understood and would have done something about.
Right. I want to point out that we will take questions if anybody feels moved. We won't wait until the end. So if you have a question, if you just kind of make yourself obvious, that would be great. I want to give a shout out to Ellen Fitzpatrick's wonderful book, which really captures the ethos of the period we're talking about. Letters to Jackie, condolences from a grieving nation. The historian Alan Brinkley said, Ellen Fitzpatrick's wonderful book, which is both a perceptive history of the public response to John Kennedy's death and selection of the millions of letters that followed the assassination, is a remarkable window into the character of the nation in the 1960s. How did you go through all those letters, and where are they? Are they at the Kennedy Library? Tell us about the methodology.
I have an incredible ability to kidnap any discussion and deviate it towards this book. Thank you for the plug.
Absolutely.
They're right over in the Kennedy Library. I just came across them doing research on another project.
Wow.
But relevant because there are many, many letters from working people and many from very poor people in the condolence mail that Mrs. Kennedy received after the president's death. And as I read those letters, I was reminded, really brought back to an earlier period in American history. There were so many people who had said that they had to leave grade school to go to work, to support their families. And the level of education, the standard of living that middle-class people have today, in the early 1960s, I mean, we have made progress as a country, and you really could see it in these letters, and it was a reminder of the kinds of issues that this commission really was focused on, and the importance of women's wages to lifting up the standard of living of so many American families was, very, very apparent in these remarkable letters.
Was there a kind of an intimacy felt with President Kennedy? I mean, the line with FDR was always, he didn't know me, but I knew him.
Yes. I think that because Kennedy was our first television president, there was a very strong sense that Americans felt that they knew John F. Kennedy and his family very, very well. Those who actually knew him, people like Esther Peterson, had her reflections on this period of American history are quite fascinating, but they also, I think, show the role that federal leadership, a strong president, can play if the right people have access to him, and he is willing to listen to what they have to say. And certainly the story of the labor movement, Sue can say better than I, in providing that kind of wedge into these changes was extremely important. Agree?
Yeah.
Yeah,
What year was it that Robert Kennedy discovered poverty in the? I mean,
Yes.
And the linkage of poverty to labor law and labor relations. If you could address that.
I did want to talk a bit about the issue of wages and poverty because it's important, I think, to understand that the agenda for the President's Commission went back to the 40s. There was a bill that Esther Peterson was very important in introducing, along with Kitty Ellickson, who was the executive secretary of the commission, and many other labor union women, also connected to the Women's Bureau. It was called the Women's Status Bill. And there were actually two equal rights bills debated in 1947 and 48. One was the Equal Rights Amendment that we're familiar with, put forward by the National Woman's Party, supported by conservative Republicans, the Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers. There was the other women's rights bill, which was the Women's Status Bill, which had at its heart a recommendation for the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women. Their argument was that there were sex-based discriminations that women faced, but not all differences were disadvantages. That was part of what they feared would be the result of the ERA. And as you saw from the video, there were many laws that raised only women's minimum wages. They didn't want to just raise women's minimum wages. They wanted to raise everybody's minimum wage. But until they could raise everybody, they didn't want to just take away that floor. And even after the Fair Labor Standards passed in 1938, which did provide minimum wages for men and women, it turned out that in the 30s, the sense of who you protect was very narrow. These were laws that were geared toward factories and manufacturing. So one of the ironies of history is that by shifting to this so-called broad-based law, it was only a minority of women who were covered. So they wanted to expand that. In 1945, and for every year after, until 1963, they introduced an Equal Pay Act. It is not the Equal Pay Act that passed. What passed was a much narrower version. And Esther always said, this is our first step. But she was very worried that we'd never take the second step, and rightly so. Their version of equal pay was that there was sex bias in how women's and men's jobs were valued and rewarded, and that we should think about raising the wages of what were the traditional women's jobs. Basically, they argued if our strategy to raise women's wages is for everybody to move to the top, what's going to happen to the 90% of the people that aren't able to do that? Because there's only so many jobs at the top. So they wanted a society in which we valued work at every level of the occupational ladder. And their focus was on wage discrimination, as well as ending the barriers to hiring women in certain jobs. They believed that was important. They just believed you had to raise the wages where women worked.
Right. I do remember that one of the trade-offs in the women's movement was giving up the advantages they had. And Nora Ephron, the late great writer, once said quite memorably, the legacy of the feminist movement was the Dutch treat. men no longer picked up the check. This gentleman, you were waiting a long time, so.
Hi, I was fortunate enough to
Woman,
grow up in a
sorry.
family where my father said, you can do anything you want and don't let anyone else tell you that. That also became a difficult thing to live up to. But I wanted to ask a question, because we always talk about trying to change people's minds, to have new laws. Why is it in the first place inequality? I mean, is it money? Is it power? How do you describe it? Maybe there's a lot of things, but if you're going to try to work against it or to change it, I'd like more of a discussion of why it exists in the first place.
It's a very challenging question. You each want to have a crack at it? Eileen, you're the bravest up here.
No, I'm the big mouth here, okay?
Right, either one, it's good.
My feeling is that we don't make either one group be the only one that gets it. It has to get it. If you're going to put something out there, you have to open it in a way that you can pass it. And that, talk about a fight, come out to San Francisco and watch them fight. They're doing it this afternoon. Because that does not work for one group, it works very well for the other. So we have to keep trying to find a way that gets us to have the person at the bottom of the ladder get enough that there's out there for them to be able to live. And those at the top figure out some way of doing something also to help this happen. We have to learn how to really work as a whole group of people. Not just it's the rich people and here's the poor people and you can't do this. We've got to come to some point of thinking so that we are a fair group of people, so that you're not leaving out one to get the other one. And that's exactly what they're spending all the time in my city. Maybe Boston does not have that kind of people. And in San Francisco, we fight.
It's the human condition.
We fight on this because there's such a huge empty space between the two. And you cannot do this. And then the houses go down. There's no place for the people to live because they can't buy a house on what they have in the country. So we really do have to think more about how do we get to be fair about making sure that people just don't die on the street because they don't get enough money. And the other people, as is repeated by the person who are not getting much money, is the other group is taking all the money. We've got to stop fighting each other. We've got to figure out how do you take a society that is not all people at the same level and put a store of information in their mouths, but really, what do we do in this country not to have people dying because they can't get anything in jobs? So, and how do we figure out how we make sure that there's a way for all the people in our society to eat and all that? And it's not about people lazy. We're not talking about lazy people who just want to get free stuff. Maybe there are 3 of them somewhere in San Francisco. This is not about that. It's about how does a person live in the United States without having some kind of closer relationship to what one needs to live in the United States.
Well, we've made great strides in very many areas over the last 50 years, but one area that is disturbing is the gap between the rich and the poor, the middle class. I mean, the people at the very top are doing extremely well, and the wages for bulk of Americans remain stagnant. Now, I'm sure there are some technical reasons for this, or perhaps, Sue, you can address that. Technical reasons, political reasons. Well,
I'll just channel the women that I write about, essentially the women of this generation, because, again, if you read the American women, they're very clear that worker organizations are a feminist issue, and that wages and economic fairness are determined, yes, by individual achievement, and they wanted to make it possible for everybody to have that ability and capacity to achieve. They also believed that it was about power, and that there was an imbalance between the power of organized capital and the power of workers. So in the commission report, they call attention to the fact that there's not been a commitment in the US for worker rights, that there's a declining commitment to support worker organization. And they talk about how we look in relation to the rest of the world. And they encourage the US to get more involved in the UN and to be a leader in issues of worker rights. So I think, again, these are very much issues that are still ones we face today. There's very much of what they recommended we've accomplished, but many of the things we've not addressed so well. And the economic inequality.
What did we accomplish that they recommended?
Is one, and then the other, I think they sought to make it possible for women to have both satisfying family lives and good jobs. They certainly believed in women's right to employment, all women. They talked about, let's have a special focus on those special discriminations that are faced by non-white women, as well as mothers. But they also wanted it to be possible for women to have more choice. So if you raise wages, then women can choose more to be at home or at work. They actually believed that there was a problem with involuntary wage work as much as involuntary homework. So they just wanted to create more choices for women.
Was the report considered radical at the time, or was it criticized by the pundits of the day for not having teeth, well, as we might say?
There's an interesting history of reception to the report, because as Kitty Ellickson and Esther both said, it was primarily greeted with derision and not taken that seriously. Not unlike, as we know, what happened after the sex was added to Title VII in 1964, a year later, that the commission that was set up, which was set up to enforce that law, didn't think that really the little phrase that said no discrimination on the basis of sex was to be taken seriously. So in many ways, the report was not taken that seriously, and here's the irony, given how it was later received, it was thought that the report was encouraging women to abandon their home responsibilities. That was certainly one of the fears. Margaret Mead had an interesting response. She was one of the few who said, and this is very much to our present day, she said the report doesn't address enough the conflict for professional women who want to have high-powered careers and a home. Interestingly, by the 70s, after the sort of rise of the new feminism, the report is thought of as conservative in some ways, moderate. There have been terms used to describe it as maternalist or protectionist. So we lost a sense of how, in fact, subversive and challenging it was for its own era.
One of the things I believe it called for was universal federally funded childcare.
Absolutely.
For American women.
Yes.
So I rest my case
Yes.
in terms of, was it regressive, was it progressive?
It also called for paid maternity, paternity leave.
Paid
Federally,
paternity leave.
Yes, paid
Okay.
leave for families. There's a whole section on all these resources that are needed for women in the home, as well as all the obstacles that exist for women when they go into employment.
I think also the changes in the Constitution on the use of money is a part of this as well. So we've got a lot of things to do, and I think we need to really talk to each other and try to figure out something that is fair. Because it doesn't make much sense to me to just keep going in one direction so that we keep getting larger and larger numbers of people who are not getting money. They're not getting, some of the things that we got are disappearing. So I always thought we were smart. And if we think we are smart, we should act smart. But act smart for the whole country, not just one part of it, because the whole country is where we live. We don't live in one island or in one house. So I think we're smart enough to do something better. And it seems to me that that's what we should try to do, because we know it does not work for everybody.
There was also a huge disconnect between, which I think the commission was alive to, and that's important in answering the question that you asked, a wonderful question that I, as a historian, have no answer to, about the roots of inequality, and that is that there was a very important disconnect between the reality of women's lives, which is that many married women were in the labor force, and the cultural and social ideals that it was a mark of status or standing to have a wife who didn't have to work. Mm-hmm. And I remember growing up, my mother was a mathematics teacher and the mother of 6 children, and she always said, "Oh, Ellen, I would like nothing better than to stay home like Mrs. So-and-so. I wanted Donna Reed for a mother. I didn't want my wonderful mother, who's 91 years old now. I was darn lucky to have her, but at the time, I wanted, the mother who was waiting for you when you got home from school and baking cookies. It was probably the cookies that I was most interested in, but in any case, I didn't have that. I had a mother who worked, and her wage was important to our family. But that was my ideal, and she always said, well, I wish that I didn't have to work. And I don't really think that's true, but certainly that, I think, is what many women felt and thought they should think at the time. I think she found her work quite rewarding. So that disconnect between the reality of women's lives, that a lot of married women with children were working, and the inequality in the workplace was finessed by saying women are temporary workers. They're only working for pin money, as it was called. And denying, of course, the even bigger reality of women who were heads of families and who were the sole support of their children. So, these all, I think, were things that the commission essentially tried to put on the table and succeeded in doing.
Yeah, that's certainly flipped today. It's the rare household that can exist without 2 incomes if it's a double income house.
I really don't think that men would not also like the choice of whether they worked or not. Give them a chance and they'll make that decision if they can do it.
Yeah.
So I think we need to look at all of those things to see where you put it, how it works, who benefits from it, in order to get a country that is not shooting at each other all over the place, and that's happening now.
Yes.
You've actually led nicely into my question. I'm working on a history of the Equal Rights Amendment in cartoon form, which is really my way of telling you I'll be emailing you both, but at some point. But I've really been fascinated by the notions of domestic sphere and public sphere that were really key even in the very beginning of creating the Constitution, creating how the society was going to be set up, and everyone needs a home to go home to, where it's going to be peaceful and calm, and then they go out into the public sphere where they have to be public people, and that men were going to be in the public sphere debating the politics, and women would be home, keeping the home that was going to be nice. And I started getting really interested. I think initially the germ was when my grandmother, who was born in 1908, laughed when I told her that when I got married, I'd marry someone who did half the housework, and it was going to be great. And she said, "That's what we thought." And I said, "What? In the 20s you thought that?" And so I'm wondering how, there is this thing, I mean, we do, because we are a democracy with this public feel, we have to be more public than possibly a lot of societies had to be, certainly in the past, that we go out there and we have to represent. How do we eventually find that balance where we have a home that we go to, which is our private sphere, which is sort of increasingly, I think that there is a fear that with the laws on domestic violence or on child abuse, that it is more and more that the government can say, you know what, you can't do that in your house, right? Which I think does threaten certain people. How does that become a balance? And I mean, how much of it can be legislation? How much of it is just about society changing and, husbands putting away laundry and things?
And have
like
the
that.
two of them make the decision as to what they want to be doing or not, changing back if you have to because it doesn't work, or one of those things. So I don't think it's impossible for us to change this, but I think we have to put our minds to it to figure out how we can make a fair decision on anything we start talking about in terms of how this money is going to take place in our country.
Well, that's a good question. How much can be done legislatively, and how much is done over the kitchen table between men and women, and men and men, and women? What laws would you like to see passed, and what, where do you see the changes being primarily societal, cultural?
What the report points out is that there are individual women who can find individual solutions for work-family balance, but that if we're going to find a solution for the majority, we need societal changes. Not just legislative accommodations like paid family leave. This generation of women worked very much through the labor movement to try to change employer practices as well. So they wanted more flexible jobs for everybody, not just professional women, with more flexible hours. They wanted women to be able to take leaves for childcare and have their jobs there when they got back. And those were things that they negotiated individually with employers at individual work sites, but they also hoped to make into public policy. And I think the final thing I would add, which I think we should, again, it's very much something that I think should be back on our agenda, is excessive work hours. Probably most people know that in the US we work longer hours than people in any other industrialized country, including Japan and many Asian countries. We just surpassed Japan, I think, about 10 years ago. One of their fundamental concerns was how you actually legislatively set not just floors for wages, but ceilings on hours. So the laws that they had passed for women, many of them set maximum hours. Employers may not work someone 60 hours a week, even if they pay them double time or triple time. This was what they thought of as the woman standard, and they wanted to extend it to everybody.
I don't see how that would be possible in the age of BlackBerries and smartphones, and people are attached to there. So anyway, it's time for us to wrap up, but I wanted to give you each a chance to say, this is looking back 50 years, looking ahead 50 years. What significant change would you like to see? Mine would be daycare that's affordable and government subsidized. So,
Well, I guess I don't like that decision. Partly because I think that's unfair to the men.
well, they have children too.
I heard you say women.
Oh,
at
I
that
said,
point.
I said daycare. Daycare, right? Yeah.
And not all of that's going to happen. I would like to add to it by decision. You know, that those are the things that are out there. And if they are out there in a way that they can be sent back, then do it for any party that wants to have that done. Mm-hmm. Why should it be by law that you've got to do this and it has to be done by hair and you have to be 32 years old or you can't go up in an airplane? You know, it doesn't make sense. And it doesn't give people to use the talents they have. And the Lord knows we need talents right now.
Right, okay.
I'm sort of struck by the way in which the issue of poverty has disappeared from the radar screen as the tilt to more conservative politics in the United States over the last 30 years has really focused more and more, understandably so, on the difficulties of the American middle class. But the persistence of poverty in this country and certainly around the world seems to me to be an issue that deserves far more attention, particularly given the centrality of women in that equation and of children. So that is what I would think of.
Right. So expand our horizons for women all around the globe. But women are still a very stressed portion of the population. Yeah.
I think that for me, the issue of how to create a more egalitarian society, because if we believe in women's freedom and want women's freedom, we believe in women's equality, I think that can't be achieved unless we have fundamental economic rights. I think someone like Martin Luther King was really clear about what difference does it matter if I can buy a cup of coffee, they'll finally serve it to me if I don't have the money. Right. And so I think that focus on making economic security and economic opportunity possible for all women was really at the heart of the commission, and I'd like to see us
and
put
incorporating,
more emphasis.
Eileen, economic freedom for all. Okay,
Yeah,
thank
sure.
you. Sorry, you take me to the next panel.
Good questions. They have some good thoughts about it, and you put them, and you put them out there too.
Could I just have 1 minute? I just wanted to point out that right now there are 2 initiative petitions being circulated in Massachusetts to put on the ballot a raising of the minimum wage so that people who work minimum wage are not below the poverty line, and a second one requiring employers to, which goes a little further than the Family Medical Leave Act, which requires employers to provide sick leave. If it's a small employer, it can be unpaid, but if it's a large employer, it's paid sick leave. Now, several of you have said the problems of economic inequality and the spread between the rich and the poor is getting worse and worse. So we have an opportunity. I suspect most of us in this room are Massachusetts voters. I did not bring my petitions with me. Find the petitions. We've got to collect 60,000 of them by the end of November and get it on the ballot and then advocate for the passage. There are things that we do certain things better in Massachusetts than most other places, but here's something we can all do right up the line you're talking about. Thank you for letting me talk.
Thank you, absolutely. Perfect, okay. All right. Okay.